We are living in an age of liftflation. What once could have been a lifetime goal, 500 and 600 pound squats and deadlifts are a dime a dozen, and you're just trying to keep up. But as a wise man once said, regardless of the liftflation on the lower body lifts, a 315 pound bench press is still pretty cool. So for you maybe haven't reached a 315 pound bench press, or maybe you've just crossed this threshold. Congratulations. And you want to push beyond that. Today we are going to talk about 5 training and programming tips to help you hit your first 315 pound bench press and maybe even go beyond. Let's get into it. So the first tip that we are going to talk about is increasing your bench press frequency. And if you've done any exploration into this topic, you probably have already found out that your 1 day a week bench press layout is not going to cut it anymore. And while it is true that some larger individuals, maybe north of 220 pounds body weight, have probably gotten their first 315 pound bench press on as little as 2 days a week of benching, a lot of smaller guys probably have to push the frequency a bit higher. And one of the things that we've discovered in powerlifting programming over the past decade is that the really impressive pound for pound benches have been bolstered by these slightly higher frequency layouts. But what I want to touch on today specifically is how do we go about adjusting our program and adding frequency in a way that doesn't send us to Snap City? Well, I think the first place that we can go is grouping ourselves and asking, do we fall into the camp of maybe having more comfort with a wider grip? Maybe we're capable of creating a bigger arch, and maybe our arm length and build are just more favorable for bench press as a whole. Or do we fall into the lanky camp where our range of motion is long, we can't arch, and we run into durability issues with bench press? Now, the reason I'm gonna create these 2 camps is that this will heavily influence what that extra day of benching looks like. Because I'm gonna generalize here, but typically you see people fall into one of 2 camps within these, which is that they are muscularly sensitive or that they are joint sensitive. And what I mean by this is that you either develop a lot of muscular fatigue from slightly higher rep range work, and that is where you tend to get beat up the most in your bench press training, or you fall into the joint sensitive camp where you're fairly resilient to workload on a muscular level, but something always gets dinged up, right? A shoulder hurts, a pec tendon hurts, an elbow hurts, a bicep tendon. All of these things we need to take into account because that will then influence what that extra day looks like at first. So let's talk about the more joint sensitive camp first. Now, like I said, these are going to be individuals that are probably more susceptible to joint related pains as a function of load, meaning that when the intensity or the percentage of 1RM on the bar creeps up, that's when problems start to arise. So in cases like this, what I would recommend as your introduction to an extra day would be some kind of mid-rep range work where you are working in further proximity from failure. So this may look like 3 sets of 4 in the high 60s to low 70% range, where it's simply giving you more practice. The absolute load on the bar doesn't encroach on those joint related problems, and it's also not high enough volume or high enough proximity to failure to create DOMs or noticeable muscle fatigue. Now, if you fall into the opposite camp where you're the more muscularly sensitive person, or maybe you are resilient at high intensities, but you create a lot of muscular fatigue early, you may have the opportunity to practice singles more often on that extra day that you add. So this may be a situation in which you're doing multiple singles at a moderate RPE, maybe even doubles, keeping the rep range low, keeping the skill element high because the percentage of 1RM is higher relative to the other group. But again, we would want to start off in this similar way where we're not just immediately going to RPE 8 or above, because this is not the main day. This is the opportunity to get better at the skill so that it then translates into those heavier sessions. So the next tip that we're gonna recommend is doing more frequent singles. Now, no, this is not me giving you license to just max out every session, and maxing out even on a singular session should not be the primary goal here, but rather giving yourself the opportunity to practice the competition lift as often as you possibly can. Now, what should this look like? Well, the first thing that I would say within this context is that you want to practice how you play. So if you have any aspirations of dabbling in powerlifting or going full bore on competing,
bro, it's Singlet Saturday.
Make sure that you're training the competition pause on all of these singles, but maybe even all of your rep work, because you will find that the technique of creating that backside tension and holding it at the chest is very different than that elastic feel you get with touch and go. And in fact, a lot of powerlifters who have been doing this for a long time will often report touch and go feeling harder than pausing. Whereas when you're newer to the sport, it feels like the opposite. So back to how would we program these singles? Well, if we're thinking specifically about our heaviest day where we may have a top single anyway, this would be my approach. First, you would take your top single and then have multiple singles. It could be anywhere from just one more to maybe 3 to 4 more singles at a certain percentage drop. Now, you're gonna have to sort this out for yourself, because there are some lifters who find after they take one single on bench press, they're done for, right? They aren't capable of replicating that level of strength, which if you are a longer range of motion bench presser, that's not uncommon. So you may find somewhere in the 2.5 to 5% range would be an appropriate weight to back off. And this could preserve the RPE, or maybe even drop it as much as 2 RPE points. But as I mentioned, the goal is not just to max out, but to get meaningful practice at these higher average intensities. Now, eventually you'll be able to work up to maybe having repeat singles. So what I usually do in my programs to progress this is I may have one single and then 2 singles at -5%, and then over time it may be 2 singles at a certain weight and then 1 single at -5%, and then 2 at a certain weight and 1 at -2.5. And then eventually we're at the point where we're doing 3 singles at the same weight, which is an indicator that our work capacity is high, and we may be in a position to hit a bench PR because our strength and repeatability of it is higher than it was before. So the third tip is something that I would consider if you are now at the 3-day-a-week or potentially even higher frequency bench press layout, which is to say to combine your heaviest bench press training with your most intense bodybuilding training on the same session. Now, the reason I recommend this is a little bit different than what you would see on potentially a 2-day-a-week bench press layout. Where on a 2-day-a-week layout, you likely have 2 very distinct purposes for each of those days, where one day is meant to be the heavy work and the top singles and the lower rep stuff, and then the other day is a hypertrophy day. But you may find over time that that layout doesn't provide enough, and your first line of defense would be to add some kind of heavier work to that higher rep hypertrophy day. And then eventually, if you're watching this video, you've probably decided, hey, I need to add the 3rd day. But as you add every additional day of bench pressing, you will find that recovery between sessions becomes more of something to factor in. And if you're having to balance recovery between sessions, you might end up chasing 2 rabbits and catching neither. Which is to say that if I'm trying to prioritize the heavy stuff on one day and then the hypertrophy on another day, you'll find that the days get clustered closely enough together that you never fully recover between them. So you may have this really bodybuilding focused day, but then the amount of time you have to rest from that session to the next, you feel a bit too fatigued for the next session. And then you try to push really heavy on the primary day, and then the bodybuilding session suffers 2 days later, and so on. So what I would recommend is actually saying, where's my heavy top set work? Put that on a certain day, and then do the more meaningful bodybuilding work after that. And the reason for this is that if you're doing your heavy work on a certain day, it's probably going to be the strongest feeling day, which means that we're probably going to be the most productive bodybuilders on that day. And if we haven't emptied the tank on our top sets, we're going to be primed to push more weight on the bodybuilding work. So what this may look like in a 3-day-a-week layout are 2 days on opposite sides of the week where we're pushing heavy top sets and heavy bodybuilding work, and then a middle day in between that exists to be the practice work. And you can imagine the contrast to this scenario is if you had a practice day, a hypertrophy day, and a heavy day, you would miss out on potentially some hypertrophy benefit, and then you also may have to compromise on how aggressively you push just for the sake of managing recovery across all of those sessions. And it only gets worse the higher frequency you go. The 4th tip that I would give is to classify 2 different types of accessories for hypertrophy. You're going to have one that falls into the category of general hypertrophy. Most lifters who haven't benched 315 simply need more muscle.
Oh my gosh, I am massive. I am massive. I am so massive. Oh my gosh.
So we're going to need bigger chest, bigger triceps, bigger shoulders, and there are movements that are generally going to target that. But we also want to think about our accessories through the lens of specific carryover. And specific carryover can exist purely from hypertrophy movements, in that if my triceps are small and I get bigger triceps, my bench is probably going to blow up. But I also want to inspect how I lift technically and where my weak points in the lift are as a result of those positions. So if I have a female bench presser who maybe grips slightly wider than her frame, and she has a lot of elbow flare, one of the exercises that's going to provide a lot of carryover for her bench press is a typical flared elbow dumbbell bench press. Whereas if I have a lifter who is a closer grip and more of a tuck style bench presser going into deeper shoulder extension, a weighted dip may have more direct carryover to her bench press. So inspect your lifts and ask what patterns are replicated and maybe challenged to a greater degree in a hypertrophy context on the accessory side of things, and have that be your sort of tier 1 accessory, and then the tier 2 stuff can be the more general hypertrophy stuff, the pec deck, the tricep pushdowns, and so on. And then the fifth and final tip I'm going to give is to have that accessory maintenance work that provides movement variability, builds tissue tolerance, and essentially fills the gaps of what ranges of motion you're not going through on your competition bench press. So what are these examples? Well, if we think about a competition bench press, we're pinching our shoulder blades together, we're trying to drive our rib cage up, and our pecs are already starting from a position of length, and then they're getting lengthened even more. And we're not really moving the shoulder blades very much. So there's a couple angles we may want to approach this with on our accessory movements. So this is sort of the tier 3 here, which is to say we want to be able to train the pec in a more shortened position. We want to be able to train the arms at varying degrees of shoulder flexion and extension, and we want to get the shoulder blades moving freely. So what are some examples of these exercises? Well, if we're talking about getting the pecs trained in a more shortened range of motion, I absolutely love the cable press around. Now, the cable press around differs from a fly in that because of the tighter arm path, we're not getting a ton of tension in the bottom, which is what we want out of this movement because I'm already getting plenty of lengthened bias training on my accessories and on my bench press. Then as I press through the movement and come across my body, I'm getting that abduction, or adduction rather, that I don't get on my competition bench press, and that is going to train my pec in its more shortened position. And as I'm doing this, I'm trying to maintain this stack of my head over my ribs, over my pelvis, and I'm getting free moving shoulder blades. The second thing we can talk about as it relates to the shoulder blades as a nice segue is doing pressing and rowing where I'm letting there be reciprocal motion of the shoulder blades and letting the rib cage move. Some of my favorite exercises for this are going to be an alternating or simply a regular dumbbell hook lying press. Now with this movement, we're trying to maintain a neutral pelvis, and as we press, we're reaching our shoulder blades away from each other, creating this protraction, and then as we come down, we're naturally creating retraction that is in rhythm with our breathing. So as we descend, we inhale and retract. As we press, we exhale and protract. And this natural movement of the shoulder blades is going to keep our shoulders and pecs a lot healthier than if we did all our pressing just pinching everything together. And then on the flip side of this, we can do rowing movements where we're allowing the same thing to happen. So a chest supported row with a really exaggerated eccentric where I'm letting those shoulder blades get pulled away from each other, or even a single arm row or pull down where I'm letting the shoulder blade move around a stationary rib cage will get that scapular movement going through a pull movement rather than just training the pecs. And then the final maintenance area we can talk about is training the arms at various angles. And personally, this has been a game changer for pec health and longevity amidst the high frequency bench pressing that I do, which is that we want to train our biceps and our triceps at shoulder flexion and shoulder extension. And the reason for this is that we are going to lose over time relative ranges of motion at external or internal rotation of the shoulder. So if we're talking about training in flexion, doing a bicep curl, we're likely improving our shoulder external rotation. If we were doing a tricep kickback bent over, really trying to get deep shoulder extension, we're improving our internal rotation. So some of my favorites are going to be the high cable curl, the cable tricep kickback, an overhead tricep extension, and then a deep extension curl. And we don't need to train these movements to failure. They are just in there to provide an adequate stimulus through ranges of motion that we aren't normally exposed to. And if you're hearing everything that I'm saying, but you're thinking, Sean, I don't want to be in charge of this by myself. I want someone to navigate this ship and help me implement the strategies you're talking about, you'll want to head over to Strength Now. Strength Now is our template-based programming service where some of the best coaches have written programs for all different levels of expertise. If you sign up for this, you will receive the program, an explanation video, an exercise library, and access to a Discord where you can talk to us coaches and learn how to navigate your program better. It is only $50 and you will have the opportunity to follow a multitude of programs, several of which I think implement what we've talked about in this video today to a fantastic degree. So head on over to Strength Now if you're interested in guided template programming. That's all I have for you guys in today's video. I appreciate all of you watching. Let me know in the comments what you would like to see me talk about next. As always, like, comment, share, subscribe. My name is Sean Noriega, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.